and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of The City and the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke. Our hero Alvin has returned to Lys in a spaceship that he has just acquired from under the desert by Diaspar. The airlock closed silently behind him as he left the ship. A moment later, there was a whispering hiss, like a long-drawn gasp of surprise, as the air made way for the rising ship. For an instant, a dark shadow blotted out the stars. Then the ship was gone. Not until it had vanished did Alvin realize he had made a slight but annoying miscalculation of the kind that could bring the best laid plans to disaster. He had forgotten that the robot's senses were more acute than his own, and the night was far darker than he had expected. More than once he lost the path completely, and several times he barely avoided colliding with trees. It was almost pitch black in the forest, and once something quite large came towards him through the undergrowth. There was the faintest crackling of twigs, and two emerald eyes were looking steadfastly at him from the level of his waist. He called softly, and an incredibly long tongue rasped across his hand. A moment later, a powerful body rubbed affectionately against him and departed without a sound. He had no idea what it could be. Presently, the lights of the village were shining through the trees ahead, but he no longer needed their guidance, for the path beneath his feet had now become a river of dim blue fire. The moss upon which he was walking was luminous, and his footprints left dark patches which slowly disappeared behind him. It was a beautiful and entrancing sight, and when Alvin stooped to pluck some of the strange moss, it glowed for minutes in his cupped hands before its radiance died. Hilvar met him for the second time outside the house, and for the second time introduced him to Seranus and the senators. They greeted him with a kind of wary and reluctant respect. If they wondered where the robot had gone, they made no comment. "I'm very sorry," Alvin began, "that I had to leave your country in such an undignified fashion. It may interest you to know that it was nearly as difficult to escape from Diaspar." He let that remark sink in, then added quickly, "I've told my people all about Lys, and I did my best to give a favorable impression. But Diaspar will have nothing to do with you. In spite of all I could say, it wishes to avoid contamination with an inferior culture." It was most satisfying to watch the senator's reactions, and even the urbane Seranus colored slightly at his words. If he could make Lys and Diaspar sufficiently annoyed with each other, thought Alvin, his problem would be more than half solved. Each would be so anxious to prove the superiority of its way of life that the barriers between them would soon go down. "Why have you come back to Lys?" asked Seranus. "Because I want to convince you as well as Diaspar that you've made a mistake." He did not add his other reason, that in Lys was the only friend of whom he could be certain and whose help he now needed. The senators were still silent, waiting for him to continue, and he knew that looking through their eyes and listening through their ears were many other unseen intelligences. He was the representative of Diaspar, and the whole of Lys was judging him by what he might say. It was a great responsibility, and he felt humbled before it. He marshaled his thoughts and then began to speak. His theme was Diaspar. He painted the city as he had last seen it, dreaming on the breast of the desert, its towers glowing like captive rainbows against the sky. From the treasure house of memory, he recalled the songs that the poets of old had written in praise of Diaspar, and he spoke of the countless men who had spent their lives to increase its beauty. No one, he told them, could ever exhaust the city's treasures however long they lived. Always there would be something new. For a while he described some of the wonders which the men of Diaspar had wrought. He tried to make them catch a glimpse, at least, of the loveliness which the artists of the past had created for men's eternal admiration. And he wondered a little wistfully if it were indeed true that the music of Diaspar was the last sound that Earth had ever broadcasted to the stars. They heard him to the end without interruption or questioning. When he had finished, it was very late, and Alvin felt more tired than he could ever before remember. The strain and excitement of the long day had told on him at last, and quite suddenly he was asleep. When he awoke, he was in an unfamiliar room, and it was some moments before he remembered that he was no longer in Diaspar. As consciousness returned, so the light grew around him, until presently he was bathed in the soft, cool radiance of the morning sun streaming through the now transparent walls. He lay in drowsy half-awareness, recalling the events of the previous day and wondering what forces he had now set in motion. With a soft musical sound, one of the walls began to pleat itself up in a manner so complicated that it eluded the eye. Hilvar stepped through the opening that had been formed and looked at Alvin with an expression half of amusement, half of serious concern. "Now that you're awake, Alvin," he said, "perhaps you'll at least tell me what your next move is and how you managed to return here. The senators are just now leaving to look at the subway. They can't understand how you managed to come back through it." "Did you?" Alvin jumped out of bed and stretched himself mightily. "Perhaps we'd better overtake them," he said. "I don't want to make them waste their time. As for the question you asked me, in a little I'll show you the answer to that." They had almost reached the lake before they overtook the three senators, and both parties exchanged slightly self-conscious greetings. The Committee of Investigation could see that Alvin knew where it was going, and the unexpected encounter had clearly put it somewhat at a loss. "I'm afraid I misled you last night," said Alvin cheerfully. "I didn't come to Lys by the old route, so your attempt to close it was quite unnecessary. As a matter of fact, the Council of Diaspar also closed it at their end with equal lack of success." The senators' faces were a study in perplexity as one solution after another chased through their brains. "Then how did you get here?" said the leader. There was a sudden dawning comprehension in his eyes, and Alvin could tell that he had begun to guess the truth. He wondered if he had intercepted the command his mind had just sent winging across the mountains. But he said nothing and merely pointed in silence to the northern sky. Too swiftly for the eye to follow, a needle of silver light arced across the mountains, leaving a mile-long trail of incandescence. 20,000 feet above Lys, it stopped. There was no deceleration, no breaking of its colossal speed. It came to a halt instantly, so that the eye had been following it and moved a quarter of the way across heaven before the brain could arrest its motion. Down from the skies crashed a mighty peal of thunder, the sound of air battered and smashed by the violence of the ship's passage. A little later, the ship itself, gleaming splendidly in the sunlight, came to rest upon the hillside 100 yards away. It was difficult to say who was the most surprised, but Alvin was the first to recover. As they walked, very nearly running, toward the spaceship, he wondered if it normally traveled in this meteoric fashion. The thought was disconcerting, although there had been no sensation of movement on his first voyage. Considerably more puzzling, however, was the fact that a day ago this resplendent creature had been hidden beneath a thick layer of iron-hard rock, the coating it had still retained when it had torn itself loose from the desert. Not until Alvin had reached the ship and burnt his fingers by incautiously resting them on the hull did he understand what had happened. Near the stern there were still traces of earth, but it had been fused into lava. All the rest had been swept away, leaving uncovered the stubborn shell which neither time nor any natural force could ever touch. With Hilvar by his side, Alvin stood in the open door and looked back at the silent senators. He wondered what they were thinking, what indeed the whole of Lys was thinking. From their expressions, it almost seemed as if they were beyond thought. "I am going to Chalmeraine," said Alvin, "and I will be back in Airlie within an hour or so. But that is only a beginning, and while I am away, there is a thought I would leave you with. This is no ordinary flyer of the kind in which men traveled over the earth. This is a spaceship, and one of the fastest ever built. If you want to know where I found it, you will find the answer in Diaspar. But you will have to go there, for Diaspar will never come to you." He turned to Hilvar and gestured to the door. Hilvar hesitated for a moment only, looking back once at the familiar scenes around him. Then he stepped forward into the airlock. The senators watched until the ship, now moving quite slowly, for it had only a little way to go, had disappeared into the south. Then the gray-haired young man who led the group shrugged his shoulders philosophically and turned to one of his colleagues. "You've always opposed us for wanting change," he said, "and so far you have won. But I don't think the future lies with either of our groups now. Lys and Diaspar have both come to the end of an era, and we must make the best of it." "I'm afraid you are right," came the gloomy reply. "This is a crisis, and Alvin knew what he was saying when he told us to go to Diaspar. They know about us now, so there is no further purpose in concealment. I think we'd better get in touch with our cousins. We may find them more anxious to cooperate now." "But the subway is closed at both ends." "We can open ours. It will not be long before Diaspar does the same." The minds of the other senators, those in Lee and those scattered over the whole width of Lys, considered the proposal and disliked it heartily. But they saw no alternative. Sooner than he had any right to expect, the seed that Alvin had planted was beginning to flower. The mountains were still swimming in shadow when they reached Chalmeraine. From their height, the great bowl of the fortress looked very small. It seemed impossible that the fate of Earth had once depended on that tiny ebon circle. When Alvin brought the ship to rest among the ruins by the lakeside, the desolation crowded in upon him, chilling his soul. He opened the airlock, and the stillness of the place crept into the ship. Hilvar, who had scarcely spoken during the entire flight, asked quietly, "Why have you come here again?" Alvin did not answer until they had almost reached the edge of the lake. Then he said, "I wanted to show you what this ship was like. I also hoped that the polyp might be in existence once more. I feel I owe it a debt, and I wanted to tell it what I've discovered." "In that case," said Hilvar, "you will have to wait. You have come back much too soon." Alvin had expected that. It had been a remote chance, and he was not disappointed that it had failed. The waters of the lake were perfectly still, no longer beating with that steady rhythm that had so puzzled them on their first visit. He knelt down at the water's edge and peered into the cold, dark depths. Tiny, translucent bells, trailing almost invisible tentacles, were drifting to and fro beneath the surface. Alvin plunged in his hand and scooped one up. He dropped it at once with a slight exclamation of annoyance. It had stung him. Someday, perhaps years, perhaps centuries in the future, these mindless jellies would reassemble and the great polyp would be reborn as its memories linked together and its consciousness flashed into existence once again. Alvin wondered how it would receive the discoveries he had made. It might not be pleased to learn the truth about the master. Instead, it might refuse to admit that all its ages of patient waiting had been in vain. Yet had they? Deluded though these creatures might have been, their long vigil had at last brought its reward. As if by a miracle, they had saved from the past knowledge that else might have been lost forever. Now they could rest at last, and their creed could go the way of a million other faiths that had once thought themselves eternal. Chapter 19. Hilvar and Alvin walked in reflective silence back to the waiting ship, and presently the fortress was once more a dark shadow among the hills. It dwindled swiftly until it became a blackened, lidless eye staring up forever into space, and soon they lost it in the great panorama of Lys. Alvin did nothing to check the machine. Still they rose until the whole of Lys lay spread beneath them, a green island in an osier sea. Never before had Alvin been so high. When finally they came to rest, the whole crescent of the earth was visible below. Lys was very small now, only an emerald stain against the rusty desert. But far around the curve of the globe, something was glittering like a many-colored jewel. And so, for the first time, Hilvar saw the city of Diaspar. They sat for a long while, watching the earth turn beneath them. Of all man's ancient powers, this surely was the one he could least afford to lose. Alvin wished he could show the world as he saw it now to the rulers of Lys and Diaspar. "Hilvar," he said at last, "do you think that what I'm doing is right?" The question surprised Hilvar, who did not suspect the sudden doubts that sometimes overwhelmed his friend, and still knew nothing of Alvin's meeting with the central computer or the impact which that had had upon his mind. It was not an easy question to answer dispassionately. Like Kedron, though with less cause, Hilvar felt that his own character was becoming submerged. He was being sucked helplessly into the vortex which Alvin left behind him on his way through life. "I believe you are right," Hilvar answered slowly. "Our two peoples have been separated for long enough." That, he thought, was true, though he knew that his own feelings must bias his reply. But Alvin still worried. "There's one problem that bothers me," he continued in a troubled voice, "and that's the difference in our lifespans." He said no more, but each knew what the other was thinking. "I've been worried about that as well," Hilvar admitted, "but I think the problem will solve itself in time when our people get to know each other again. We can't both be right. Our lives may be too short, and yours are certainly far too long. Eventually there will be a compromise." Alvin wondered. That way, it was true, lay the only hope, but the ages of transition would be hard indeed. He remembered again those bitter words of Seranus: "Both he and I will have been dead for centuries while you are still a young man." Very well, he would accept the condition. Even in Diaspar, all friendships lay under the same shadow. Whether it was 100 or 1,000,000 years away made little difference at the end. Alvin knew, with a certainty that passed all logic, that the welfare of the race demanded the mingling of these two cultures. In such a case, individual happiness was unimportant. For a moment, Alvin saw humanity as something more than the living background of his own life, and he accepted without flinching the unhappiness his choice must one day bring. Beneath them, the world continued on its endless turning. Sensing his friend's mood, Hilvar said nothing until presently Alvin broke the silence. "When I first left Diaspar," he said, "I did not know what I hoped to find. Lys would have satisfied me once, more than satisfied me, yet now everything on earth seems so small and unimportant. Each discovery I've made has raised bigger questions and opened up wider horizons. I wonder where it will end." Hilvar had never seen Alvin in so thoughtful a mood and did not wish to interrupt his soliloquy. He had learned a great deal about his friend in the last few minutes. "The robot told me," Alvin continued, "that this ship can reach the Seven Suns in less than a day. Do you think I should go?" "Do you think I could stop you?" Hilvar replied quietly. Alvin smiled. "That's no answer. Who knows what lies out there in space? The invaders may have left the universe, but there may be other intelligences unfriendly to man." "Why should there be?" Hilvar asked. "That's one of the questions our philosophers have been debating for ages. A truly intelligent race is not likely to be unfriendly." "But the invaders, they are an enigma, I admit. If they really were vicious, they must have destroyed themselves by now. And even if they have not," Hilvar pointed to the unending deserts below, "once we had an empire. What have we now that they would covet?" Alvin was a little surprised that anyone else shared this point of view, so closely allied with his own. "Do all your people think this way?" he asked. "Only a minority. The average person doesn't worry about it, but would probably say that if the invaders really wanted to destroy Earth, they'd have done it ages ago. I don't suppose anyone is actually afraid of them." "Things are very different in Diaspar," said Alvin. "My people are great cowards. They're terrified of leaving their city, and I don't know what will happen when they hear that I've located a spaceship. Jesserac will have told the council by now, and I would like to know what it is doing." "I can tell you that. It is preparing to receive its first delegation from Lys. Seranus has just told me. Alvin looked again at the screen. He could span the distance between Diaspar and Lys in a single glance. Though one of his aims had been achieved, that seemed a small matter now. Yet he was very glad. Now, surely, the long ages of sterile isolation would be ending. The knowledge that he had succeeded in what had once been his main mission cleared away the last doubts from Alvin's mind. He had fulfilled his purpose here on Earth more swiftly and more thoroughly than he had dared to hope. The way lay clear ahead for what might be his last and would certainly be his greatest adventure. "Will you come with me, Hilvar?" he said, all too conscious of what he was asking. Hilvar looked at him steadily. "There was no need to ask that, Alvin," he said. "I told Seranus and all my friends that I was leaving with you a good hour ago." And we will follow Hilvar and Alvin where they're going next time.